with the countdown, I just start without any preliminaries. Hello, my name is Dr. DeMonte Holt. I am really excited. Thank you for your time, for you guys being with us on today. Truly, we are looking for an exciting and life-changing moment as we talk about a very relevant discussion in regards to trauma. And I know a lot of people lately have been using trauma as a buzzword. Sometimes even people make jokes of having PTSD or things of that nature. But no, we expect to have a wonderful time as we go through this training and presentation. So my name is Dr. Holt. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a certified traumatologist, and I am a trauma crisis specialist. And I also am certified in mental health as well. And so pretty much I work with some of the most difficult, challenging schools, most definitely that have issues with behavior and issues with low academics, the disparities among discipline or areas of school discipline, school to prison pipeline issues, you name it. And a lot of times we fail to realize a lot of that comes from when the brain most definitely is not working or operating efficiently or is healthy because of life devastating things that has happened to people. Most definitely performance is going to be an issue, behavior is going to be an issue. And so today we're going to be talking about not just trauma informed care, which is kind of like the traditional model, but trauma informed, trauma responsiveness, with a correlation of us having a conversation and training about, how has COVID impacted our communities, our nation, our educational system? It most definitely has. And so, and I guess I would tell you the whys to why I do it. I think a lot of times people talk about what they do and how educated they are, what degrees and certifications they have. But I think the why is very important, and the why may be important, more important than the what. The why I do it is because I believe that where we are today, that trauma is the new public health crisis in our education system, and we are 30 years behind. Yes, 30 years behind. And we have to catch up. We have to catch up really quick. We were 30 years behind before COVID, and most definitely now during COVID. We're not post-COVID yet because of the variants. Version of COVID is on the rise. But what are we doing? What does that look like for our education system? I would tell you that trauma is no longer about just looking over students and trying to support students with chronic stress and traumatic experiences. But I think now that we need to have a robust approach to where it's now about the entire school community. So no longer is it just students, but what about our teachers? Teachers are suffering from, educators are suffering from high levels of second traumatic stress like none other. This is the reason why we have compassion fatigue and burnout that is extremely high. And so what does that look like for the school psychologists and the counselors and the school social workers that is experiencing secondary traumatic stress and burnout? So I'm going to be coming with a strength-based approach that, in my opinion, very robust, having those tough discussions, but yet being very, very scholarly and looking at the neuroscience of how trauma impacts the brain, the nervous system, and memory, and our bodies physically. But the good part is, and the good news is, we don't leave you just dealing with the negative of trauma, but there is resilience. There is an opportunity where the brain can rewire and it can heal. And so that's what we're excited about today. So let's get into it. And so I work for Metro State University as one of their expert consultants in trauma, which is the Region 4 Equity Center. Which stands for Western Educational Equity Assistance Center. These are the states and regions that we cover. These are some additional areas that I am experts in: restorative practices. So sometimes our policies are so strict. The 3 strikes you're out policies, 0 tolerance policies have created disparities and extremely high levels of discipline among kids of color and poor children. So I work in areas to help school districts also remedy some of those issues that they have. Equity specialists, as far as diversity, equity, inclusion work, compassion fatigue specialists. So certainly I understand and I know what I'm talking about when it comes to people who are suffering from burnout. So these are some of the kids that I work with. I like to give you a little visual of some of the kids that was counted out, that could not learn or have been described as having a learning disorder or too aggressive to learn in class. But kids really don't care about how much you know until they first know how much you care. And so, believe it or not, love does make a difference in the classroom. And it is our job to make sure in the midst of learning centers that we are creating healing spaces. I'm a big fan of this statement. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I believe a lot in my trauma work has a lot to do with dealing with early childhood trauma. Most of our adult issues, according to what Frederick Douglass is saying, a lot of times comes from our early traumatic experiences that we did not address well. So I know you heard of a terminology called traumatologist. I'm a traumatologist, which means that in the field or specialty in psychology, there is a specialty called traumatology. And those that practice traumatology, which would be people with advanced education in psychology, a lot of postdoctoral work of mine is in looking at how trauma impacts the brain, nervous system, the physiology, the psychology, the emotional, but more importantly, what are best practices and strategies to help people heal, because you can heal from trauma. I always say that trauma may not be your fault, but certainly it is your responsibility to heal from it. Because if you don't heal from trauma, you will bleed over people that did not cut you. Another statement I always say that trauma may be your history, but certainly trauma does not have to determine your destiny. It may be part of your past, but it does not have to erode your future. And so when we look at trauma, we hear the big buzzwords of trauma right now, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or everybody now is talking about trauma-informed and trauma-informed instruction, and gladly so. I'm happy about that as a traumatologist. I'm happy to hear that, because there was a time that we didn't talk about it enough. But a lot of times we hear about trauma-informed models today in post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of us fail to realize where did that come from? And so trauma been around, it just looked different or described different or has been diagnosed different because we were very limited on the science of how violence and exposure to brokenness and life devastating issues impacts the brain. And so when we go back into the 17 and 1800s, we saw doctors and physicians and neurosurgeons began to see some very similar symptoms among war veterans. And so many of them were having a difficult time re-entering the population, coming back home with different psychological issues, emotional issues, insomnia, depression, anxiety, having nightmares. These are some of the similar signs that we were seeing in those times, in the 17 and the 1800s. So just giving you a little history, as we began to see some of that differently in World War I and World War II. World War I, some was described as shell shock, some was described as combat neurosis in the Vietnam War. So we saw those similarities of people that were struggling with different layers of trauma in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And they were called different things: traumatic neurosis, railway spine, war hysteria. And so the book where practitioners in mental health, behavioral health make diagnoses, the DSM-2 in 1968 was dealing with trauma and post-traumatic stress as a historical neurosis. The DSM-3 called it PTSD in 1980. And this is very historical because 1980 is when we actually got a real diagnosis of dealing with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. In 94, we saw the DSM-4 called it PTSD and associated with with different things. DSM-5, which is the most latest model by which diagnoses are being done for behavioral health and mental health, is the trauma spectrum. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. If some of you are familiar with ACE, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it pretty much is a model and an instrument that came out in the 90s as we surveyed over 17,000 individuals to assess and evaluate early traumatic stress and its outcomes on individuals when they qualify 4 or more ACEs. And what we saw, people that had 4 or more ACEs or 4, and pretty much it's a questionnaire. Let me give you a little bit more information. Questionnaire, about 10 questions that asks about different things in your early childhood life, from divorced parents. Do you have any family members who have been incarcerated or struggles with mental health, or have you been abused by a caregiver or a parent? And if you qualify for all of these different answers, you would get certain numbers in your ACEs. If you had high numbers in your ACEs, pretty much people began to see emotional issues, psychological issues, and most definitely physical issues. So if you look at the adverse childhood experience triangle from the bottom up, you can see how devastating trauma impacts individuals. Again, I'm not talking about just dealing with students anymore. We're talking about the whole school community. The entire school community has to look at trauma. It's not just students anymore. We now have to make sure that our teachers are healthy, our social workers are healthy, our counselors are healthy, our school psychologists are healthy, that bus driver, that security monitor, the principal. A lot of times we don't even ask the principal, how they are doing, right? So, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at the triangle, trauma impacts the whole person. Starting from the bottom up, we see that we have generational embodiment, historical trauma, social conditions, adverse experiences, disrupted neurodevelopment. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to show you through the neuroscience that trauma just don't impact my brain and my memory and my nervous system, but it also compromises its growth and development. That is key to having a high quality life mentally and emotionally as you grow up to be an adult. We see at the end that people who struggles with early childhood trauma that has not been addressed properly and unaddressed, not only makes you sicker mentally, psychologically, and emotionally, but physically, it impacts your physiology and it makes you sicker. And I'll talk a little bit about constantly being in a high alert and overly stressed with trauma impacts your immune system. Isn't that very, very important, especially in the climate we're living in with COVID right now? We certainly don't need children immune systems being compromised to address infections and recover from sickness, seeing that COVID right now is a big issue in our society today. And at the end of the day, at the tip of the top of the triangle, you see early death. Usually individuals, according to our data, is showing that people die 10 years sooner than they should. So it shortens your lifespan as well as impact you on the negative. When we look at, again, trauma, we should be looking at it from a whole school community. And as you look at the graph, you will see this encompasses everyone, the students. We need to be making sure our staff and teachers are okay. We need to make sure that even our parents sometimes is okay, because a lot of the times the great innovations that we bring into the school sometimes is broken down because of some of the housing and maladaptive environments that a lot of our children are struggling with. Again, if you see me constantly talking about trauma from a whole different lens, not just from kids, but the whole school community, the whole culture and climate of our schools, and the organization itself needs to have a trauma lens going forward. Trauma shouldn't just be this one-hit wonder kind of training that comes in and an expert get you trauma informed, and then when the expert leave, everybody go back to the same thing. No, we have to get to the point to where we are anchoring trauma responsive practices into the organization and system of our schools. Okay, so when we look at trauma is really serious. It can come in the form of child abuse. Not just physically, right? We know that abuse can be verbally, emotionally, physically, sexually. But when kids are struggling in these areas, you're going to most definitely see it. It is most definitely going to manifest in the classrooms, in the behaviors, in the mood swings, with aggression or defiance, or just suffering from dissociation. These things are very, very important. So when we talk about trauma, these are some of the real things that a lot of our kids are struggling with neglect. When a child is neglected, is a form of trauma. It does something to them. Yes, poverty is a major issue. Poverty is a chronic trauma. And I'm going to talk about the different types of trauma in a few moments. But poverty opens the door for homelessness. Can you imagine a kid, you're asking a kid to pay attention to algebra and trying to have them pay attention to English? Are you kidding me? That kid has so much more going on their brains besides classroom instruction. Okay, and so this is why we want to make sure that when we're talking about trauma, that we're understanding some of the things that opens the door that impacts cognition and executive functioning and the ability to stay regulated. Hunger, starvation, mass incarceration is huge, ladies and gentlemen, huge. And it's very traumatic for a child's parents to be stripped from the household due to incarceration. Most definitely, we have a lot of fathers that's been incarcerated. But we are seeing a new trend of an increase of a lot of mothers now are being incarcerated. So most definitely, this is a traumatic experience. Grief, and it 5 dimensions of grief: acceptance, denial, depression, anger, and bargaining are all factors of being a traumatic experience. And grief, we know associate grief mostly when someone passes away or through death. And most definitely that is because it's a separation. But really, grief and loss takes place when there's a major separation. So yes, most definitely traditionally that would be death. If a loved one passed away, a parent passed away, a caregiver passed away, that grief and loss can be very traumatic. But again, grief is really focusing on separation. So that's not just death, ladies and gentlemen. That can also be a divorce. That when kids are having to struggle with going through divorce, and the parents, the adults themselves, that you do go through a grieving process, or you should, if you want to address it from a healthy perspective. Seeing that we have separation of family, foster care and group homes is an issue, and it is very traumatic to be stripped from the home, stripped from the structures that you are accustomed to, and living in other structures that you're unfamiliar with can be very, very traumatic and is very traumatic. Let's not forget about our Hispanic, Latina brothers and sisters that have issues with the border. The border issues and detainments and detention centers are still a factor in these communities. And so we want to make sure that when we are having our students of color from Latina community, Hispanic community, let's be mindful that these are still some issues that are going on in that community. We used to be told when we were younger, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words would never hurt me. And what I've come to realize, that is a lie. Matter of fact, if we be very, very transparent, bullying Israel, number one, and then bullying is very traumatizing. And the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of schools may address bullying in regards to discipline or in regards to school code of conduct. But we need to deal with bullying way better and more progressive than intervention. But really, a good bullying program for schools is prevention. And so a lot of us address bullying from discipline, but we don't have comprehensive bullying prevention programs where kids can be open and honest, and there is a place of communication where if a victim has been victimized, that they can get help and get support. Bullying is very traumatizing. We have 160,000 American students that suffer from anxiety and fear to go to school because they're afraid of being bullied. Cyberbullying is a whole nother monster today, to where kids now can be bullied by social media, by Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and email and text messaging. So bullies now can even show their aggression on kids without even being at school campus because of technology. So again, please think about, when we think about being trauma informed, that bullying is a factor. Again, I alluded to before, our traumatized teachers, looking at how are you, asking teachers, are you okay? And creating a platform where teachers and staff can come to the powers that be and say, you know what, I think I'm not okay. And I think that in the climate of what we're seeing with the Olympics, athletes coming out about mental health and saying, you know, I'm having issues performing at optimum levels because I'm just not okay. I think this is a great paramount moment that we can be opening that door to allow not just athletes, but the professionals that we depend on every day, from the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers, the paramedics, the doctors, and the RNs who have been exposed to a lot of secondary trauma. Let's make sure that they are okay, because the struggle is real. Why should we look at this? I tell you, because a teacher attrition is an issue. We are hurting all over the nation in regards to getting some great qualified, bona fide, certified teachers. Some teachers are just not in the game anymore. The first 2, 3 year teachers are overly stressed with trauma, and now because of the education system is changing, our veteran teachers, our master teachers, are retiring early. So we have a teacher shortage on the front end and on the back end. On the front end, we have teachers that are either transferring to other schools or leaving the profession, period. Or we have even master teachers and veteran teachers retiring early because they just don't know how to deal with the extra level of trauma and stress that's coming into the classrooms. So please understand that teacher attrition, teacher retention is all coming a lot from levels of trauma. We also know that teacher burnout is also an issue. And so we want to make sure that they are doing okay. Again, so I'm showing you a slide that shows that in public education, how educators in the first 5 years are being impacted about trauma. Now, Dr. Holt, why do we see this happening? Well, there's a lot of additional reasons. The big one is we are not preparing educators for trauma in the classrooms. We have not done a good job on that. If you ask me, I think that there should be a small piece in the degree program for teachers to learn more about psychology, sociology, or some trauma, or get some trauma informed training in the midst of the degree program. So by the time that they graduate and get certified and go to the classrooms, that they are able to have better tools in their toolkit. Now, ladies and gentlemen, everything I talked about was pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, think about that, pre-COVID. So now think about where we are. We're dealing with trauma during the pandemic. The pandemic is most definitely have shifted the education system, our whole country, our nation, every system and structure and institution we have depended on. COVID-19 certainly has impacted, and if you better believe it has certainly impacted the education system and everyone that is involved in it. It impacted our financial stability in our country. Many families have been impacted financially through joblessness and unemployment. At one point, unemployment was over 15% in different states. Joblessness was on a high. Even evictions was increasing. And then on top of that, while we're dealing with all these traumatic experiences, we had George Floyd tragically die at the hand of police officers, which opened the door for racial tension and racial trauma in our nation, in our communities. I mean, when I tell you that 2020 has been brutal on our community and traumatizing on our nation and on our families, let me tell you, the struggle is certainly real. And we also do know that racism in itself and discrimination in itself is a very traumatic experience. And a lot of our students of color have been impacted in some kind of way. So I come to tell you, bringing all this into fruition is to say that trauma, I believe, is a public health crisis in education. It is serious. And say what you want, if we don't address trauma and chronic stress that is imploding many of our schools, classrooms, and school districts, we're on a crisis. We have a crisis on our hand. And that also opens the door to People who work in areas of high trauma, if it's not well addressed and supported, we are also creating an occupational hazard. That's what I said, and I'm not taking it back. We are creating an occupational hazard. And this is why we have to make sure that our staff are okay. Why? I'm glad you asked me, because I'm going to tell you that dysregulated teachers cannot educate dysregulated kids. You cannot have dysregulated kids in the room and dysregulated professionals in the room. You cannot have dysregulated students and a dysregulated principal trying to lead and administrate a school. It doesn't work that way. The brain doesn't work that way. We both have to have both individuals regulated in order to create this culture and climate of instruction and academic performance. So again, when we talk about PD should be more than just data and talking about policies and procedures and best practices in PD for teachers. We also need to be including social emotional support, making sure that they are okay. Okay, so when we look at secondary traumatic stress, it's pretty much working with people. If you have a position or a profession, working with people with high levels of chronic stress. If you don't take care of yourself, you're going to be impacted as well. And so some of the symptoms of STS is compassion fatigue. I'm sure you probably heard of compassion fatigue. I want to give you some of the symptoms. So just in case you're not sure what does that feel like, you might be experienced that, might have experienced that. But if not, you might in the future if you don't take care of yourself. 1, chronic exhaustion. 2, reduced sympathy and empathy. 3, feelings of anger. 4, dreading work. Poor job satisfaction, hypersensitivity, poor work-life balance, difficulty sleeping. It's just some of the things that you can only imagine that what a lot of people struggle and go through. Again, we talked about grief and loss being something huge. But let me also touch on moral injury, because I know a lot of times we talk about being burnt out, compassion fatigue, but moral injury is also one of the great things that many professionals that deal with secondary trauma it feels. And pretty much what moral injury is a psychological behavior or distress of psychosocial and psychological distress of people that struggle with things that goes against their moral compass or their moral standards. So we had a lot of this science is really based on veterans in the armed forces to when they have experienced some issues, far as, for example, a fellow colleague gets shot and they die, and they did everything they could to save their life. They struggle to going home with that. They struggle with the fact that they couldn't save that person or change the outcomes of an individual. And so they have self-guilt and they refuse to allow themselves to grieve and allow themselves to forgive themselves. And so that's what moral injury is. And so I thought it was interesting because I believe that a lot of our educators in our education systems have really suffered also from moral injury in the classroom because they had remote learning, they had to practice social distancing. They did not have a chance to see their students. They didn't get a chance to make sure that their students are okay. And that was really hard for a lot of our educators to be separate from their kiddos. And so that's what we talk about on the moral injury piece. And so just think about not just the veteran, not just first responders, not just veterans on the war field, but just common people have struggled with this thing called moral injury. So the big question is okay, Dr. Holt, what in the world is trauma? I'm glad you asked. And I'm gonna tell you trauma is 2 things: psychological trauma. Number 1, psychological trauma is an injury and emotion to the brain. When life devastating things happens to you, it's not just you getting over it. It's not just you moving on with your life. We've had people try to do that time in and time out, and they get their butt kicked every time because the brain just does not perform that way. There are some life devastating things that has happened to people to not only it impacted the brain, it rewired the brain. Okay. And naturally, when we grow up from children, from infant to toddler and adolescence into adulthood, our brain is to properly develop by building connection. But when trauma and traumatic things happen to people, you shift from connection to protection. So the first thing that we define trauma is, number one, it is a psychological and emotional wound to the brain. And that happens when we are exposed to crazy levels of violence. We used to only look at war heroes to have trauma, far as dealing with being in World War One, World War Two, Vietnam War, the Iraq War, Kuwait, Afghanistan. But what we realize in today's science is that the brain is not also just impacted by violence in war, but the exposure to violence, period, whether it's community violence, whether if it's violence in the home, domestic violence, the brain is impacted. Secondly, trauma is additionally a stress that is so overwhelming that you struggle coping with it. So trauma is two things. As a definition, it's a psychological, emotional wound to the brain where life devastating things happen, and then secondly, it is a wound that is so overwhelming that we have a difficult time coping with that stress, and that is what we would call trauma. And also, let me also talk about the different types of trauma and trauma responsive schools, which is a framework that really anchors trauma informed and trauma sensitivity and trauma practices within the school. But there are several things I want to talk about on the types of trauma. And number one is acute trauma. Acute trauma is a trauma that happened one time but still have long-term ramifications. For example, if you're a 9-year-old and you got in a bad car accident and here you are now 40 and you're still triggered by that accident, that we will call an acute trauma. Then the second will be chronic trauma, which is a more long-term trauma, like I call poverty, because you're not broke for 2 days and 2 weeks, right? So when you are living in some socio-economical challenging environments, poverty most definitely can be very, very traumatic. Just think not being able to have food on the table, dealing with homelessness, staying with your auntie, staying with your grandmother 1 month, staying with someone else another week. That's very traumatic. Okay. Then we have what we call complex traumas, when individuals are going through different traumas at the same time. And a lot of our students are going through complex trauma. Generational trauma is when individuals, one generation struggles with trauma, but because of the fact they didn't break the vicious cycle, then that trauma is goes into the next generation. So sometimes what we've seen grandparents go through, the parents go through, and the child go through, and the future child who's not even born yet perhaps will go through it. Another thing we look at is epigenetics. It's a science of how also trauma impacts the DNA and the genes of individuals. So this really gets really deep when we talk about the different types of trauma. Some of the things I want you to look at as well is, how does childhood trauma impacts individuals? Remember, I said trauma impacts the whole person, the physical, the emotions, the relationships. Some people in adulthood have issues with building attachments with individuals because of childhood trauma that happened to them when they were 7 years old and it was never addressed. And this is the reason why Frederick Douglass said it's far easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. The more the more we have to repair broken men and women is because a lot of times of the early childhood traumas that was never addressed. We certainly know there's a huge link between mental health and trauma. Babies are not born depressed, right? Depression comes from a reason. You're not born with anxiety. Babies are, and children and adults have anxiety for a reason, because something happened, something traumatic happened. So a lot of times when we look at mental health, most definitely there's a strong link with trauma and mental health. Behavior, being able to be regulated. The reason why we see a lot of bad behavior in schools is not because of bad kids, but because of bad situations and bad outcomes that have created these bad outcomes for children. And so behavior is a serious issue. Brain development, we most definitely know, is an issue. And that's the reason why we also should be pushing for strong, comprehensive early childhood education schools to really get that brain stimulated and get them prepared. And cognition, my God, which create language delays and learning ability disabilities because of cognition has been impacted because of trauma. When we look at trauma, I want you to get a visual what schools should be looking like for trauma. If you notice, trauma is the anchor, it's the foundation. And then we connect all these wonderful programs from MTSS, PBIS, restorative practices, social emotional learning, equity, and bullying prevention, and many more. Notice a lot of times the schools have great programs, but they're siloed, they're redundant. With some, the left hand doesn't know the right hand knows what's going on. But you really can't impact behavior until you first deal with the cause. And so I always say trauma is like the virus or the bacteria in our education system. And if the bacteria is not addressed, it creates an infection. So a lot of the issues that we're seeing in our school systems is really just symptom clusters of infections of a bacteria that have not been well addressed. So a lot of times what we've done throughout the years is given a bacteria a ibuprofen or Tylenol or Motrin, but really to clear up the symptoms, you have to give it an antibiotic. If you clear up the bacteria, the symptom clusters and the negative manifestations will eventually begin to clear up. Okay. Trauma on the brain. If you see on the right, we see that people who are living in an abuse situation, a maladaptive situation, it does impact the brain. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not talking about Care Bear stuff. I'm talking real neuroscience work. We see through the imaging when people are overly stressed, abused, living in poverty or exposed to violence, it impacts your brain. If you look on the left-hand side, you see a healthy brain that is lit up, stimulated, rocking and rolling, learning like it should, functioning like it should, creating those great outcomes. And so when we talk about trauma, people being traumatized, it's really people living in a life of a fight, flight, or freeze. And when this stimulation of cortisol has been released. And so the thalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis is all impacted when we're going through trauma. And it's all important. These 5 regions of the brain is to help us to save our life. So when people get into a fight, flight, or freeze, that's the norm. That's how it should happen. But the problem is that we should not be in a hyper arousal state long term, because if it does, it impacts your brain, it impacts your mind, it impacts your memory, it impacts your nervous system, and it impacts your body. So let me give you a practical story real quick. Let's say you're minding your business and you're running and you're working out and you're jogging and you run into a brown bear. What do you think your brain is going to do? Your brain is going to get into a high alert, and your your pupils going to dilate, your breathing is going to change, your blood is going to rush, your muscles going to constrict, and it's going to get you into a high alert, hyperarousal state so you can save your life. When that brown bear leaves, guess what happens? Your whole body, your brain goes through a calming because it no longer perceives a threat. The question, my friend, is what happens to students who live with brown bears every day? What happened in adults who live with rattlesnakes every day? It keeps your brain overly stimulated and on a high alert too longer than what it should, which impacts cognition, which impacts the ability to regulate behavior. And this is why in school we see low academics and we see bad behavior in schools, is because the brain has been impacted. So what do we do with all of this great knowledge, Dr. Holt? I'm glad you asked me. Before I go into my close, also brain impacts memory, implicit memory, explicit memory. The 2 big ones I want to throw out is episodic memory and emotional memory. These big 2 are huge because episodic deals with how I felt in the moment, or where I was in the moment, and emotional memory is about how I felt in the moment. And so a lot of times we are triggered based on life-threatening situations or life-devastating situations in our life based on where we were, which is episodic, and how we felt, which is emotional memory. Trauma is real. This is why post-traumatic stress, known as PTSD, is a big issue. It's because people are triggered based on something that was an episode or something that was emotional. Okay, so I close out on this dealing with fixing it. Okay, Dr. Ho, you talked about all these different things and how COVID has impacted us in this time. Can we rebound from trauma? The answer is yes. Can we get our life back? The answer is yes. Can we heal? Most definitely, the answer is yes. So there is healing in trauma. There's resilience in trauma. Dr. Bruce Perry, one of our leading psychiatrists, professors of psychiatry who did a lot of groundbreaking work in this area of psychological trauma said relationships is the key. Healthy relationships is the key for all children. And relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. Believe it or not, it's not psychotic meds. It is not antidepressants. Giving people a whole lot of meds. Don't get me wrong, medication has its place, but I do not believe in practitioners and primary physicians just throwing out a whole lot of pills without really peeling the layers of the onion and getting a broader understanding. But relationships is the key. Again, in order to teach kids, you first got to be able to reach kids. Again, in order to teach curriculum, you first got to build a connection that comes from relationships. The second R is regulation. We want to promote regulation. The more students are regulated, the better that their outcomes are going to be in the classroom. If they're dysregulated, if they're moody, if they're going through some hard times, it's going to be difficult for them. Same way with the teacher. We got to make sure the teacher is regulated. We want to make sure that they are on point and they are regulated. Let me speak a little bit more on regulation. When we see the students are really having a difficult time, they might need to be removed from the classroom. I don't oppose that. I just don't believe that every time a kid is thrown out or a student is thrown out of class, they got to get disciplined. They got to get suspended. They got to get expelled. How about we do all we can to keep students in the classroom as much as possible so that they can have greater and much better outcomes in the classroom. And so with that being said, if it is a situation where they do need to be removed because they're so dysregulated that they're impacting classroom management and they are being very disruptive, then create another space where students can go through a calming space, a calming room, a place where maybe they can do mindful meditation or mindfulness and get calm and get regulated so that they can come back into that classroom setting and stay in that instructional setting. Because the more that we keep kids behind books, the less we will have to put them behind bars. Because we know the facts of the matter is that if kids are not educated, they're probably going to be incarcerated. And then when we look at the data among kids of color, African Americans, Latino, and Native American students, the stats are alarming. Relaxation is the key, keeping people relaxed. Students need to be relaxed, parents need to be relaxed, the teacher needs to be relaxed. The more we are relaxed, the more the brain is stimulated to perform. Restorative practices, restorative justice, when people do make bad decisions, because that's going to happen. And they're not the first, and they're certainly not going to be the last. But what we do have is a problem with our discipline. That 3 strikes you're out and 0 tolerance of discipline is huge on creating disparities among students of color and poor children. So one of the best things we need to do is when we're talking about looking at trauma from a trauma lens is that we create more of a restorative approach. Introducing restorative justice and restorative practices into discipline and shifting the culture and the policies from being so super punitive to being more restorative. We have been harsh on discipline, but it is now time for us to be smart on discipline. And then resources is a big key. Resources. When people are in need, they need to get the help that they need. A lot of teachers don't know that their school districts offer free mental health sessions for them when they're having a difficult moment. Please use those moments. Remove the stigma about mental health. Students need to be getting support on trauma and social emotional learning. Let's make sure that they are getting the resources that they have. And when we add restorative practices, relationships and whatnot, this is what creates the power of resilience. The resilience is the key. And reimagining finally is what I want to talk about is self-care. Self-care is going to be key. Teachers, professionals, let me tell you, if you don't take care of yourself, you are no good for nobody. So the more you do more for yourself and making sure that you're okay, the better you can be fit for the fight, the better you'll be stable mentally, emotionally, and socially for the student. So think about self-care. Think about setting boundaries. Think about believe it or not, sometimes you got to put yourself first. That don't mean that that's being narcissistic. That means that you're taking care of you in order for you to do for others. So make sure your cup is full. Just like your gas, just like your vehicle need more fuel in the gas tank, and your gas is telling your gas tank and your gas light is on, reminding you that your fuel is too low. Think about your brain and think about your mind and think about your soul, how it needs to be replenished. So please understand that you got to love yourself first. And so finally, as I close out, think about reimagining self-care. There's a difference between self-care and self-soothing. Some people say, I want to do something for myself. That's great, but make sure it's self-care and not self-soothing. Dr. Holt, what's the difference? I'm glad you asked, and I'm going to tell you. Self-soothing is something we do for ourselves. It felt good at the moment, but we pay for it later. That's not self-care, that's self-soothing. Self-care is always about your promoting wellness mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the whole person. Let me break that down a little bit more. Self-soothing is always about what feels good to you. Self-care is always what's good for you. Self-soothing is always about what feels good to me, but self-care is about what will always be good for me. And that is the difference, ladies and gentlemen. So when we talk about taking care of ourselves, look at this 8 dimensions of wellness. How are you physically? Are you eating right? Are you putting the right fuel in your body? Are you drinking water? Believe it or not, there's some people that don't drink enough water, and most of the symptoms of illness they have is because of dehydration. Occupation. Are you in the right occupation? Do it give you joy? Do you have passion about it? Mental. You might need a therapist. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean you're crazy. It doesn't mean you need to go to the crisis center or you need to go to a psychiatric ward. You just need to do what's best for you and your mental health. Environmental, social, intellectual, financial. Why bring financial up? Because a lot of our stress comes from financial debt. Believe it or not, some people are stressed the heck out because they do not know how to handle their debt. And debt and bills will create massive amount of stress on the brain and the mind. And your spiritual connection. That could be your church, that could be prayer, that could be meditation, that can be yoga, whatever that is. Make sure that you are doing what you need to do, because if you don't take care of yourself, you will be no good for nobody else. I'm closing, and I'm telling you that trauma could be a history, but it does not have to be your destiny. You must heal from trauma, because if you don't heal from trauma, you will bleed over people that didn't cut you, because hurting people hurt people. So let's make that change. Let's begin to look at best practices on how to heal. There is resilience above trauma, and the resilience doesn't start tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. It starts today. So again, this is Dr. Holt. Thank you so kindly for taking my class and taking my training on today. I hope that there was some great aha moments, some great light bulbs that clicked on. But let's take this training on into the real world, and let's create healing spaces in learning centers. Take care.
That's very strong. I wrote that automated bus.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, really? Right now, it's all conference mode. Okay. Let me know my boss, because I don't need to be checking until tomorrow. But I'm going to keep off. And my password is tomorrow will be in the meeting. It's such a guess.